A man walked down a long, dark hallway dressed in a three-piece gray suit. His black dress shoes squeaked with every step he took on the freshly polished floor. The man passed numerous rooms as he walked, but didn't stop until he reached the surveillance room. He pressed his hand to the scanner on the wall and it turned green. The door then opened and the man stepped inside. Inside the surveillance room, it was spacious but poorly lit due to it having no windows. There were dozens of computer monitors off to the sides and one large screen in the middle of the room. Someone sat at every monitor, focusing intensely on the screen. However, they all stood up and saluted when the man entered the room. The man saluted back and then waved his arm to signal everyone to sit back down, which they did. As soon as everyone was seated, the man continued walking into the room where a young supervisor was waiting for him in front of the screen. After stopping in front of the supervisor, the well-dressed man asked, "Did you find them?" The supervisor smiled and then nodded to a woman sitting at a nearby computer monitor to his left. The woman typed a few commands and then the large screen behind the supervisor suddenly displayed a satellite image of a huge military base. Both the supervisor and the well-dressed man studied the image closely. The base had two main runways on the east side, 4 large hangars to the north, and 4 buildings along the west that varied in size and appearance. It was difficult to tell what those 4 buildings were from the picture, but one thing that was easy enough to tell was that the perimeter of the base was lined with a tall metal fence, so it was obviously heavily fortified. Our mole has confirmed that the 2 reactors were taken by the N.R.C. to their base located close to Bangor, Maine, the supervisor said, pointing to the screen. The well-dressed man nodded. Although it wasn't ideal for the reactors to be in the hands of the N.R.C., at least their location was known. "Well," he told the supervisor, "it's a good thing that we've been aware of this base for months. However, just to be sure that there are no major changes in their security measures, we'll send out a stealth team to survey the area before we make our move." With that being said, the man walked out of the surveillance room and headed further down the hallway. He reached an almost identical door to the surveillance room, except this door had a name on it: Dr. Gustav Heisenberg. The well-dressed man once again put his hand to the scanner on the wall and the door opened. He stepped inside to find an older man sitting behind a desk in the dark corner of the room studying something on his computer. "Dr. Heisenberg," the well-dressed man said to get the doctor's attention. The doctor looked up from his computer and smiled at the man as he entered the room. "Well, I guess you do still have time to visit an old friend," the doctor said in a thick German accent. Dr. Heisenberg stood up as the man approached him and the two shook hands. The doctor sat back down and gestured for the man to sit in the chair on the other side of his desk. The well-dressed man sat down across from the doctor and said, "I'm sorry that I haven't been able to stop by very often. As you know, we've all been extremely busy lately." "I understand how busy you are, sir. Running our organization while trying to please the board of directors is no easy task." "No, it is not," the man agreed. "Which brings me to the other reason I stopped by. What are the results from your recent experiments?" Heisenberg combed back the few pieces of gray hair that he had left on his head. He was obviously very frustrated, but he tried not to show it. "Well, sir, I'll give it to you straight," he said to the man who could end his career if he wanted to. "We aren't getting the results we want." "What do you mean?" the man asked. Heisenberg tried to put this delicately. "Even with the radiation sample that you have provided us with, we aren't able to create reactors. Every attempt that we make to improve the test subject's physical capabilities with radiation results in death from radiation poisoning." The man sat silently for a few seconds as he absorbed what the doctor had told him. He then slowly asked, "So the test subjects who volunteered, are they all?" Heisenberg slowly nodded. "Yes. None of the test subjects survives the experiments." The man was silent for a moment, thinking about the results of the experiments. Dr. Heisenberg waited patiently for a response. The man finally cleared his throat and said, "These experiments were never guaranteed to work. But luckily for us, despite the small miscalculation and a few other setbacks, our contingency plan was successful." Heisenberg's eyes widened. "You mean?" "Yes. Although the core of the atomic planet landed on Prince Edward Island instead of along its coast like we planned, it did manage to affect 2 people and turn them into reactors. The core was then destroyed, but that no longer matters." Dr. Heisenberg was smiling from ear to ear after hearing this great news. "So where are the reactors now?" "The N.R.C. has taken them back to their base, but I assure you that they will not be there for long." Heisenberg stood up to show his enthusiasm. "Sir, if you can get me even one of these reactors, then I assure you that I will figure out how to create them." The man stood up as well, pleased with that answer. "Don't worry. I promise we'll get them back from the N.R.C. Heisenberg shook the well-dressed man's hand once more before the man turned and left the room. He checked his watch as he walked towards the elevator at the end of the hallway and, realizing that he was running late, quickened his stride. The man entered the elevator and rode it down to the first floor of the building. The elevator doors opened, revealing a giant garage full of military vehicles, crates of heavy weaponry, and soldiers. Some of the soldiers were doing a few different training exercises, while others were taking inventory of the stored weapons and ammunition. The well-dressed man ignored the activity as he quickly made his way across the garage floor. He walked around a tank that was under repair and approached two armed soldiers who stood guard in front of a door. As soon as the soldiers saw him coming, they both saluted the man before one of them turned to press his hand to the scanner, opening the door. Before stepping through the door, the man looked back at the busy garage. Although none of the soldiers had yet received word about any upcoming missions, every one of them was running around the building preparing for whatever was about to come. The man glanced up at the catwalks high above the garage floor where one soldier was giving another lessons on how to properly survey the area from above. The well-dressed man felt his chest swell with pride at the obedience and skill of his soldiers. The man then turned back to the open door in front of him and walked inside to find half a dozen men and 3 women sitting around a conference table in mid-discussion. One of the soldiers, who had her long red hair pulled back in a tight bun, was saying,
"The recent tests we ran with the jets that were equipped with grapple cannons have been a huge success. I am certain that they are combat ready."
The man at the head of the table said, "Excellent news. We may in fact be needing them soon." He then turned to the man who had just entered the room. "Sir, we're glad you're here. We have a lot to discuss." At the head of the table sat Captain Rick Griffin. He was the commanding field officer and second in command to the man who had just entered the room. Other than Heisenberg, Captain Griffin was the only person that the well-dressed man trusted enough to know everything that was going on within their organization. The man sat down across from Captain Griffin at the other head of the table. He then unbuttoned his gray suit jacket to get more comfortable before beginning to speak to the small group of people sitting around him. As most of you already know, yesterday the core of the atomic planet landed on Prince Edward Island and turned 2 people into reactors. The young man and woman who were affected were quickly taken by the N.R.C. to their base in Maine. These 2 people are the only living reactors on the planet, so we need to apprehend at least one of them. What we are going to do is send in a stealth team to scout the base so we can figure out the best plan of attack. Then we will attack the base when the N.R.C. least expects it and apprehend either one or both of the reactors. Are there any objections? Nobody raised their hand. The well-dressed man then nodded confidently. No longer will this organization live in the shadows. Once we have these reactors, we will be able to finally put our plans into motion. We shall finally be able to achieve the goal that this organization was founded on. The room erupted into applause. Shortly after the cheering died down, people began to exit the room until only Captain Griffin and the man in the gray suit remained. Captain Griffin smiled at the man. "That was a hell of a speech." The man chuckled. "Well, I had some time to think it up as I walked down here." After saying this, the man walked over and shut the door so that nobody could overhear their conversation. "How did the meeting go with the investors?" he asked Captain Griffin. Captain Griffin sighed. "Not great. They're giving us less than 3 weeks to get results, or they'll pull our funding." The man smacked his fist on the conference table in frustration. "Well," he said, "we did see this coming. Our last 2 missions were by far the most expensive, and those morons will pull their funding if we go even a penny over budget." Captain Griffin nodded. "But those missions were vital. Dr. Heisenberg wasn't making any progress with his research even with the sample we acquired for him. We had to try something drastic, and although it didn't go exactly according to plan, it still resulted in the creation of 2 reactors." "I know," the man said. "We are closer to our goal than ever before. Once we get our hands on one of the reactors, Dr. Heisenberg is confident that he can figure out a way to recreate the effects. As soon as that happens, we will have everything we need to save the world." "Then let's go give the order," Captain Griffin said. The well-dressed man nodded, and together, the 2 men walked out of the room to inform the soldiers of their newest mission. When Tessa and I first arrived at the N.R.C. base, I thought we would be instantly thrown into a cell and experimented on. Instead, the 2 of us are treated like royalty. We're driven around in one of their jeeps, and every time an N.R.C. agent passes us, they stop and salute, which is so much nicer than when they point their guns at us. After our first encounter with Tessa's father, he wanted to give us a complete tour of the base. Although we were both exhausted since it was probably around 11 o'clock at night, it didn't really sound like we had a choice. So the 2 of us agreed, and we climbed into the back of his jeep. The N.R.C. base is enormous. To the north of the base are 3 helipads and 4 giant hangars where most of their planes and other vehicles are stored. And to the east are 2 large runways lit up by blinking red lights. However, we mainly ignore that side of the base and instead drive to the west where there are 2 buildings right next to each other. The first of these 2 buildings we're shown is simply called the gym, which General Walker tells us is where all the agents train and work out. I had noticed that General Walker kept referring to his soldiers as agents, so Tessa and I started doing the same. From the outside, the gym doesn't look very impressive, but when General Walker leads us inside the building, we're able to see just how massive it is. The inside of the gym is divided into 3 sections, with the first and largest section being the workout area. The workout area itself is the size of a large commercial gym and is full of your standard gym machines and equipment like treadmills and exercise bikes for cardio, a rack of dumbbells ranging from 5 to 100 pounds for your upper body, a few squat racks and bench presses, and about 100 other machines all devoted to targeting every muscle in your body. Due to how late it is, there are only a few agents training in the gym, but at least it's a good time to get a tour. Past the workout area, area on the other side of the gym is the combat training area. This section of the gym has 4 different boxing rings, at least a dozen punching bags hanging from the ceiling, and a couple of practice dummies. As I look around this area, I think back to all the boxing practices I've gone to over the years in a gym that looked like a rundown version of this. And then after practice, my dad would be waiting outside to take me home and ask me about everything I'd learned that day. I attempt to push down all these thoughts of my father as General Walker leads us to the final section of the gym. Tessa and I follow General Walker to the left side of the gym where there's a set of thick, semi-soundproof doors. General Walker opens the doors for us, and inside we see a long firing range divided up by barriers into 12 equal lanes. There's only one agent using the firing range at the moment, and from the sound of how loud his shots are, he's definitely using a real gun, which I find a bit surprising since the agents at the school had only used their special electric rifles. At the far end of the gun range seems to be a weapons closet, but General Walker is already leading us out of the firing range before I have a chance to see what kinds of weapons are inside. That concludes our tour of the gym, so General Walker leads Tessa and I out of the building. As we walk towards our Jeep, I try to avoid making eye contact with the 4 agents who are parked nearby in their own Jeep, watching us. These agents have been following us ever since the start of the tour, and I assume they've probably been ordered by General Walker to watch us in case anything happens, but I still don't like being watched so closely. The 3 of us climb back into the Jeep, and General Walker drives us to see the building right beside the gym where the agents eat and sleep. The bunks, as General Walker calls it, resembles a 3-star, 10-story hotel from the outside, but looks a lot nicer on the inside. The building's lobby is beautiful, with hardwood floors, plush furniture that's off to one side, and a large wooden desk where a pretty blonde woman stands waiting for us. She smiles and waves at us as we walk through the lobby. Just as General Walker is leading us into the elevator to show us the rest of the building, he looks at his watch and says, "I'll show you the rest of the bunks later, but right now, we have a meeting to get to that should answer all your questions." So we do a complete 180 and walk out of the building. We then hop back into the Jeep and drive towards a tall building that's closer to the north side of the base. As we drive, I look out the window and manage to get a glimpse inside one of the hangars where a huge black cargo plane that takes up nearly the entire hangar is parked. This is one of the only buildings I haven't shown you yet. General Walker tells us as we drive. It's where we meet for important discussions, and it's also where our scientists and engineers conduct nearly all their research. Because of this, we nicknamed it the office. Almost as soon as he finishes saying this, the Jeep comes to a stop outside the front of the building. The 3 of us get out and walk inside, where we're greeted by 2 armed guards standing on either side of a huge metal detector. I hesitantly step through it, and when I see a green light flash on top of it, I let out a sigh of relief, even though I obviously don't have any weapons on me. Once General Walker, Tessa, and the agents who've been following us all step through the metal detector as well, General Walker leads us down the first hallway to our left. We keep walking until we reach a thick steel door at the end of the hallway. General Walker takes a key card out of his pocket and swipes it over the door's lock, and the door instantly opens. Our group quickly enters the room that is already buzzing with activity. About 30 or so people are inside, but seem to have little idea what this meeting is about, so they all quiet down and turn to General Walker as soon as he enters. I can tell by the obvious tension in the room that although most people aren't sure what this meeting is about, everyone knows it's important. There's a large screen at the front of the room mounted high enough on the walls that everyone can see it, a few computers off to the sides which are occupied by agents, and a conference table in the middle of the room that isn't nearly big enough to seat everyone. The people in the room who are either staring at General Walker or Tessa and I are an equal mix of agents and scientists in stereotypical white lab coats. When General Walker makes it to the front of the room, he turns to face the crowd of people. Before he says anything, he motions for Tessa and I to sit down in 2 seats near the head of the conference table, which we do. First of all, General Walker begins, "I would like to thank everyone for coming here on such short notice. Now, before I say anything else, I will confirm that the rumors all of you have been hearing are true. We have found 2 reactors today." The room goes deathly quiet. Even though I don't know what a reactor is, from context I can tell that he's referring to Tessa and I. The agent I had overheard on the bus must not have called us retractors. He had called us reactors. Josh Davis and Tessa Walker have both been exposed to radiation from the core of the atomic planet. General Walker is about to say more, but I put a hand up and he stops. He gives me a funny look, which embarrasses me a bit, but I'm tired of being in the dark about all this. General Walker looks at me and says, "Yes, Mr. Davis." I clear my throat. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but would you please explain to me what exactly happened to the 2 of us and what the hell you were talking about?" People around me smile at my question and are acting like I'm some dumb little kid who just did something cute. Before I can ask again more firmly, General Walker says, "I suppose it is time we give you 2 an explanation." The lights get dimmed and the large screen behind General Walker begins showing black and white pictures of a bunch of scientists working in a lab. General Walker says, "Towards the end of the Second World War, both the Allies and the Axis powers were in a race to create a weapon of mass destruction. the atomic bomb. As you probably know, thanks to the combined efforts of America, Canada, and the British, the Allies succeeded in this race, and in 1945, they created 2 combat-ready atomic bombs. I remember learning about the Manhattan Project in school. As interesting as it was to hear about the first and only time nuclear weapons were used in warfare, when these bombs were dropped on 2 different Japanese cities, it resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians. My history class ended up having a debate on whether or not it was necessary for the United States to drop those 2 bombs, since Japan was most likely going to surrender anyway. Regardless of that, I wonder what all this has to do with me. General Walker continues, dropping those 2 bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki resulted in the deaths of many Japanese civilians. However, something else happened when those bombs were dropped that the public was not informed of. The screen changes to a few black and white pictures of different people standing in piles of rubble or outside of destroyed buildings. At first, I think the people are on fire because their bodies are smoking, but as I take a closer look at the pictures, I realize that there are no flames. The United States military discovered that some people were able to survive the initial explosions and lethal amounts of radiation. 6 people, to be exact. The radiation reacted differently with their bodies and gave them abilities similar to the 2 of you, hence why we call people like this reactors. General Walker nods at Tessa and I. However, they were extremely unstable because their bodies couldn't contain such high amounts of radiation, and they exploded, causing a large number of casualties. I'm sorry, they exploded? I interrupt. General Walker nods. Yes, their bodies couldn't take the strain of containing that much energy, and they exploded after a short period of time. Tess and I look at each other, and I know we're thinking the same thing. Will we end up exploding as well? General Walker probably senses what we're both thinking about, but he keeps talking anyway. After World War II had ended, almost every nation leader had heard about what the radiation had done to those people. The United Nations was founded to try and make peace between countries and ensure that nothing like that would happen again. However, a few years after those events had happened, countries had developed organizations to secretly research nuclear weapons and see if they could replicate the effects that it had on the people in Japan. He switches the picture on the screen again to show a black and white photo of the outside of a building. On the front of the building, there's a sign that reads, the Nuclear Research Center. We were the United Nations Research Center for Nuclear Energy. With a base in most major countries, the N.R.C. tried every type of ionized radiation to replicate the effects, but we were unable to. In the process, we were killing a lot of people with our experiments. So, the United Nations made a law stating that no country was allowed to use nuclear energy for anything other than an alternative power source. The N.R.C. was then changed from experimenting on people with nuclear radiation to protecting others from doing so. Let me guess, I say. Some countries didn't agree with this. General Walker seems a bit surprised that I'm actually following all this information. Yes, countries didn't want to stop experimenting with nuclear energy, but at the same time, they agreed about how dangerous it was. So, world leaders thought about it and decided to continue the experiments off-planet so they would no longer risk harming innocent people. Tessa interrupts.
Wait a minute. If all these countries agreed to stop making nuclear weapons, then why do we hear so much about countries having them?
I was actually thinking the same thing. General Walker says, the general population can have a lot of influence over issues of international security. We knew that if people found out that there were bombs powerful enough to destroy major cities and countries chose not to develop them, there would be an uproar from a high percentage of the population. Instead, we chose to let the public know about these weapons and think that countries had them at their full disposal, but in reality, there are no nuclear weapons on Earth. Even in North Korea? I asked, remembering a news report I saw recently on the rogue nation talking about how they were creating all sorts of nuclear weapons. General Walker pauses for a second and then says, while the United Nations doesn't agree with how the country is being run, we are monitoring the North Korean government from satellites and from agents on the ground. We have found no signs of nuclear radiation, so we don't have any reason to believe that any of their threats are legit. A similar situation occurred during the Cold War when the Soviet Union threatened nuclear war with the United States. Of course, neither country had any nuclear weapons at their disposal, but they couldn't tell that to the public. So they just continued to threaten each other until they eventually made peace. But what about known nuclear disasters, like Chernobyl? I asked. As I said, countries came to an agreement to no longer create nuclear weapons or experiment on people with nuclear radiation. However, countries were unwilling to give up using nuclear energy as an alternative power source. We couldn't force countries to stop building and using nuclear reactors without a formal agreement, so although Chernobyl was a devastating disaster that our organization could have prevented, we were unable to interfere, especially since it was during a time when relations between the Soviet Union and United States were most tense. Even though what he's saying is pretty difficult to wrap my head around, it sort of makes sense. You always hear about countries having nuclear weapons, but it's not like you ever see them. So it's not too hard to believe that there aren't any nuclear weapons or experiments involving nuclear radiation on Earth. But if they aren't on Earth, then there's only one other place they could be. I realized that the timeline of when the United Nations declared that nuclear experiments could no longer be conducted on Earth lined up a little too well with another major event in human history. So when you said continue the experiments off-planet, is that why the United States landed a man on the moon in 1969? Was it just a cover-up to see if you can send nuclear weapons into space? I ask. The screen changes to a picture of the Apollo 11 spacecraft. General Walker nods. On some levels, yes, that was the reason. The United Nations wanted to see if it was possible to send rockets into space, but we knew that we couldn't cover that up from the public. So, both the Soviet Union and United States were tasked with the mission of landing a manned spacecraft on the moon, and as you know, the United States were successful. However, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Mitchell Collins landing on the moon was just a cover. I tune out for a second, struggling to believe what I'm hearing. One of humanity's most prized accomplishments is actually just a cover-up. I wonder what else the public has been lied to about. Soon after these 3 astronauts returned home safely, General Walker continues, countries started experimenting on nuclear radiation in space. There was a large sector that was chosen so the explosions wouldn't be visible from Earth. As the years passed, countries began to experiment with different types of radiation such as alpha, beta, and gamma. Eventually, something happened that nobody could have predicted. I watched the screen change again to a picture of the moon. At least, I thought it was the moon. But I take a closer look and notice that this picture of the moon is glowing yellow in some places. This isn't our moon. We called it the atomic planet, and even after all these years, the world's brightest scientists still aren't 100% sure how its creation was possible. However, what they were able to discover was that there was a massive number of neutrons floating around in the area due to all of the atomic bombs that have gone off over the years. These neutrons eventually came into contact with a number of asteroids in the surrounding area and began to turn them reactive. All of the reactive asteroids then came together into one large ball of mass the size of a small moon. This newly formed radioactive mass was then continuously hit by cosmic radiation from solar flares, causing it to turn into a somewhat stable, radioactive planet. Nation leaders were so amazed by it that they had a satellite built called the Artemis that would monitor the planet 24/7. Using the Artemis, we discovered that every experiment involving radiation that we did in space would cause more asteroids to turn radioactive and become a part of the atomic planet. For over 40 years, countries would watch over the atomic planet and learn more about radiation than we ever could by making bombs. General Walker switches the screen again to show a picture of a bunch of large chunks of rock spread out across a small area in space. This is a picture of the atomic planet that was taken 3 months ago. It was blown up a week before this picture, General Walker tells us. A noticeable silence fills the room, and I realize it's because not everyone in here knew about this. I had just heard about the atomic planet 5 seconds ago, and even I can't believe that after 40 years, it just blew up. It doesn't make any sense. Of course, there was a lot about what was being said that didn't really make much sense either.
How did it blow up?
Tessa asks, breaking the silence. I expect General Walker to say something very scientific that won't make much sense to me, but will at least clear things up. Instead, he takes a deep breath. They're called Nucleus. Nucleus is an organization that has been around almost as long as we have. Our goal is to stop people from doing harmful experiments with nuclear radiation and creating nuclear weaponry, and instead use nuclear energy in forms that can help people, like nuclear medicine or fusion batteries. Nucleus's principles are the opposite. They plan to create more people like you so that they will have an unstoppable army of reactors. We have been able to stop them over the years, but they're very determined and well funded. So these people blew up a planet? How is that possible? I ask. General Walker paces back and forth for a few seconds before saying, 3 months ago, the day that the atomic planet blew up, the Artemis was out of commission for a few hours to be repaired. A team of Nucleus soldiers took an unknown spacecraft to the planet, killed the repair crew, and planted multiple explosives on the most unstable parts of the atomic planet. They blew it up and then headed back to wherever they came from. The only reason we know it was them is because the Artemis sent us a picture with its one working camera right before it blew up along with the planet.
If the planet is a secret, then how would they know about it?
Tessa asks. We have our suspicions that they have allies in places of high power who have the credentials to know about everything I just told you. They might also have intel that we don't know about. Why would they even want to blow up the atomic planet? How would they benefit from it? I ask him. The best we can figure, they collected samples of the radiation before they blew it up. Those were all my questions on the matter. I don't even think to ask the most important one until Tessa asks it for me.
What does all this have to do with us?
General Walker nods like he was expecting us to ask that. With most forms of nuclear energy, there is always a power core, where all the energy is the most powerful, but also the most unstable. There was a core for the atomic planet as well. When the planet blew up, the core somehow stayed intact. It circled the Earth for 3 months until something caused it to enter the Earth's atmosphere. As it plummeted towards the Earth's surface, it absorbed all the heat that it was producing from traveling so quickly and started to become even more unstable. We were able to track where the core was going to hit and tried to relay a message for everyone to evacuate. I finally realized what he's getting at. The core from the atomic planet was a meteor that hit the school. He nods but looks a bit annoyed that I interrupted him. Yes, we knew that it was going to hit your school, so I went and spoke to your principal to try and inform him of the danger, but he wouldn't listen. So after we hacked into your school's database to get everyone's phone numbers, we played a message to warn people about the meteor. Unfortunately, nobody in the school listened to the message except for you, Mr. Davis. Everyone looks at me, but I try not to notice. General Walker continues, you saved the lives of everyone in that building, but it wasn't just because you got everyone to evacuate. I look up at him, confused. What do you mean? Because of how hot the meteor was and the fact that there was no way to cool it in time, an explosion was inevitable. We assumed that it would explode on impact, but when it hit you, your body absorbed most of the radiation that the meteor was giving off and prevented it from exploding on impact. Tessa's body did the same thing, and you two basically absorbed all the radiation out of the core, making it stable long enough for you to get it out of the school where it could explode without causing any harm. The radiation from the core is what gave you your enhanced abilities. I suppose that makes about as much sense as it possibly can. Considering everything you just said sounds crazy. Tessa and I somehow absorbed a bunch of radiation that should have killed us, but instead made us really strong. Simple, I guess.
How come only the two of us were affected by the core?
Tessa asks. We believe that the two of you are reactors, just like those 6 people who were affected in Japan. Reactors are extremely rare because out of over 250,000 people in the 2 Japanese cities who were affected by radiation, only 6 became reactors. Some people have the ability to absorb vast amounts of radiation without it causing them any harm. The radiation is absorbed by their cells just like any normal person. However, instead of it destroying their DNA and killing their cells, it mutates and enhances them, making them stronger. If anyone else in your school was exposed to the radiation, then they would have gotten radiation poisoning and suffered very painful deaths. Tessa's face turns pale as the same thought that's running through my mind hits her. What if some people at the school were exposed to the radiation? Just as I'm about to ask that very question, Jenna Walker reads my mind. We checked every person who was at the school at the time that the core hit, and nobody showed any signs of radiation poisoning. We believe you two absorbed all of it, so there wasn't any radiation left to poison them. And in case you were wondering, you two are not giving off enough radiation to poison anyone either. I sigh with relief that nobody else had been affected by the radiation. It would have been awful to find out that after saving everyone from a burning school, they later died anyway from radiation poisoning. General Walker turns off the screen and the lights come back on. He announces to everyone in the room, "Alright, that's everything. Thank you all for coming." Almost everyone in the room gets up and leaves except for General Walker, a few agents, and Tessa and I. General Walker walks up to us and asks, "Do the two of you have any more questions?" Almost simultaneously, Tessa and I say, "No, sir." He nods. Good. Now before we can talk to the two of you any further, we need to administer a few tests in order to be completely certain that you're not harmful to yourselves or others. We both nod and follow General Walker out of the room, with the agents following us at a short distance. As General Walker leads the way to wherever they're going to test us, I wonder if these tests will reveal if there's something seriously wrong with us.